Day 1100 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 871,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,150 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, 8 tanks, 13 APVs, 69 artillery, and 1 air defense system. Then as for a different set of figures, Russia's fighting capacity has shown a depleted trend in terms of daily assaults over the past 3 to 6 months, where it peaked in early to mid-December, with current levels averaging anywhere between 38 to 50% down from that peak. Now, I won't go as far as to say that Russian combat potential is spent, but a couple of things to mention. As with this graph, Russia maintained their operational tempo throughout the bulk of the winter, something not seen for them during the same time period last year. And when I noticed this newly emerging pattern, this trend, 6 odd weeks ago, I just had to question Russia's ability to maintain this pace of operations. Because often the opposite is true, where Russia would normally otherwise gear up in mid to late February. But since they've been going all in over the past few months, it's hard to A, sustain that, and B, increase from that level. And seeing the 7-day moving average indicated in the red line here, this should be somewhere in the 200 range for offensive combat operations by the armed forces of Russia right now, but instead it's roughly around the 100 range, because Russia's winter approach instead went for an uptick in military operations, almost unquestionably due to expected upcoming peace negotiations brokered through the incoming new US administration. But as we see here right now, it's been difficult, if not impossible, for them to maintain that type of momentum. And though it is true, or at least likely, that we'll see an uptick in Russian offensive soon, the degree of what that looks like is questionable. But above all, they should have increased these rates by now, meaning that they're actually coming to the party late. Then headed across to the map and headed to Bryansk. Because seen here is a member of the Russian Mobile Air Defense Unit who unsuccessfully tries to shoot down a Ukrainian large-scale drone known as the E-300 Enterprise, which was reported to have later struck a target in the region. And evidently, those traditional air defenses were no match for a slow, low-flying UAV. Where are Russia's modern air defenses in all of this? And for a border region, no less. I'm somewhat reminded of the German teenager Matthias Rust, who flew from Helsinki, Finland to nearby the Moscow Red Square in 1987 on his Cessna 172. Then to a change of pace on the map and headed to Russia's Dagestan region, where residents are living like they're in the 18th century. Not my words, theirs. As the residents say that they are fed up and are making a video appeal to their regional government, coordinating their plea to fix the problems of lacking basic necessities, including gas, water, and electricity. They're cold in the winter, and the power is still off when it comes to summertime. Even though they're paying their utility bills on time, they're getting nothing out of it, and seemingly equates the situation to a lack of funding due to the special military operation. But they don't even call it that, they call it a war, and question how many more sons have to die in the war. Plus, there's the earlier mention of how they feel like they're living in the 18th century and not the 21st century. They also appear to threaten that they'll make a video appeal to Putin as well. That won't help much. And I'd say what's perhaps most striking here is how they state that they've been dealing with this problem for years. And I'm willing to bet that this was before the SMO, but I'm also willing to bet that due to Putin emptying regional coffers to support his war, that the problem has only become exacerbated since then. And it just occurred to me a moment ago that these Russian residents should simply just stop paying their utility bills. It's not like it's working for them, and less funding for the war. Then headed back up to the map into the Kursk region, where the Ukrainian SOF destroyed 6 armored vehicles, including 2 tanks alongside communication equipment belonging to the armed forces of Russia. Now, as a refresher, the Ukrainian SOF is the Special Operations Forces units, who are the elite specialized groups within the Ukrainian military trained for high-risk missions. Their tasks include conducting secret operations, gathering intelligence, and working in small teams to counter specific threats, which includes the active participation in military operations near the front lines inside of Kursk. And interesting fact, the first significant deployment of the Ukrainian SOF at the Kursk front lines occurred moments before the incursion into Russia's Kursk Oblast, which began on August 6, with the SOF units in particular infiltrating the region on August 4, positioning themselves strategically ahead of the main assault. Then headed across into the Donbass, and in a recent and striking display of individual valor, a soldier from Ukraine's elite Rubiz brigade single-handedly captured 6 Russian soldiers along the Seversk front. This event happening sometime in late February, not long ago at all. So for this situation, after an ambush that left their UAZ vehicles disabled, the Russians, hiding for 3 days without food or water, were methodically flushed out and apprehended. This incident, while seemingly small, does certainly starkly contrast with the well-trained and the highly motivated Ukrainian forces, as opposed to the ill-prepared Russian counterparts, as additional reports suggested for this matter that these Russian captives had minimal training, and with none having more than 10 days of preparation before being sent into combat, highlighting the desperation in Russian ranks. And so is the case further below, as in a related topic for the region, there is a theme prevailing here. Because Russian telegrammers most recently spoke about an acute shortage of people for assault operations, calling it a shortage of fully fledged soldiers, adding that the Ukrainian forces were taking advantage of this. The Russian telegrammer specifically refers to the Constantinople and the Pokrovsk directions, where events like these are especially pronounced, which is quite interesting because the Constantinople direction is where the Russian forces are hitting hardest right now. And so these messages go on to say that the Ukrainian forces are repeatedly counterattacking and driving them out of a number of their own positions. But it does get worse, because in the message they mention now that military police convoys bring in disabled people with incomplete rehabilitation, all supplied as a means for use with their own Russian assault operations. So with all of the events like these, we've gone from isolated examples, one here and there, to an increased prevalence, which is where we're at now, and headed in the direction of this becoming their status quo, where this is a taste of what the Russian army will be generally comprised of. Then after that, it becomes essentially a non-functioning army. Then to another important development on the map regarding Russian aviation-launched FAB munitions, as reports continue to show now that the accuracy of these munitions are plummeting, with the source of these comments coming from many directions, but most recently coming from the Russian aviation-linked fighter bomber Telegram channel. He cites overwhelming electronic warfare interference, rendering satellite corrections ineffective for these weapons, and while reports suggest that many of these FABs still hit, they often miss their intended targets. So this is very much an important and developing update, further suggesting that Ukrainian electronic warfare specialists are innovating and mastering techniques that saturate the front lines, complicating precision strikes of the Russian forces, and doing so as a means of erasing one of Russia's main battlefield advantages. Then also on the map for today, taking a look at something in a bit of a different light, we see the AFU continuing to create new fortifications for their units. These photos depict a network of zigzag trenches reinforced with metal frames and wire mesh, filled with sandbags or surrounded by protective earth barriers. all installed with the help of not shovels, but engineering equipment. So these trenches, part of Ukraine's broader defensive strategy, are designed to provide robust protection against Russian advances, particularly near key towns along the Donbass front lines. Further images show the AFU installing a concrete bunker, likely in response to the ongoing threat of Russian aviation-launched ammunition and various artillery fire. Now, the scaling up of building these fortification structures has been a point of my critique in the past, where it almost felt like the capability to do so was scaling up in lockstep with ammunition production. In other words, slow. However, recent reports continue to indicate that Ukraine has been increasing the rate of these fortification build-ups and becoming exceedingly efficient at doing so. In a way, we have the Vovchansk front to thank for that, where an investigation led to the hammering out of those sorts of issues. But hey, took them long enough. Every military should be open to critique, although it's an opportunity not afforded to the Russian military, because on the flip side, as it comes to these fortification build-ups, just lackluster performance when it comes to the Russian constructions. Fairly much across the board with what we know, and of course most commonly built through the use of shovels or even their bare hands, as part of an often noted and striking lack of equipment needed for their earthworks. Then, on the topic of combat readiness, Belarus announces it begins checks of its armed forces involving large-scale redeployment of soldiers and equipment. But the amount of times they advertise this preparatory activity, with usually framing it as some sort of a very aggressive stance, never seems to materialize into anything more. And there's probably good reason for that. The small nation of Belarus would effectively be selling out their own nation and losing it if they were to ever commit to direct land-based military actions into Ukrainian territory. Luckily for them, their absence in such a role has kept their small dictatorship able to preserve its functional capacity. Then to take a look back in time for the map today, because on this day in 2014, thousands of Crimeans, including Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, protested outside the Crimean Verkhovna Rada Parliament building in Simferopol, and done so against the threat of Russian intervention after Ukrainian President Yanukovych was ousted after some very pro-Russian policies, which was in complete opposition to the pro-Ukrainian policies that he got elected on. Now, these protest participants aim to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity and resist efforts to separate Crimea. However, the next day, unmarked Russian special forces, known as Little Green Men, stormed the building, raised the Russian flag, forcing lawmakers at gunpoint to install a puppet government and vote to join Russia, marking the start of Crimea's occupation and leading to the controversial referendum and Russia's annexation in March of the same year. Putin claimed at the time of these events that the Little Green Men were unrelated to the Russian state, but later, in a 2015 documentary, Putin was boastful about ordering special forces to take Crimea. Then headed across to some news for today. So, in a stark display of ongoing aggression, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and other Kremlin officials have outright rejected any ceasefire in Ukraine, as well as the peace terms proposed by Trump and European leaders, where it includes the Russian surrender of Russian-held Ukrainian territories. This hardline stance reveals a negotiating position that is really just not realistic, but also deeply entrenched in expansionist ambitions. And those Kremlin ambitions may not stop at just Ukraine. Finnish political analyst Juzzie suggests that Putin could leverage negotiations to expel Finland and Sweden from NATO and demand a return to the 1997 borders. An agreement of that magnitude would certainly welcome Russia into the Baltic states with arms wide open. Now, as for the US side, the White House framed events differently, most recently stating that any deal to end the war in Ukraine will leave both sides somewhat unsatisfied, quote unquote. On top of that, 40 US lawmakers and members of Congress signed a letter urging Trump to stop supporting Putin's illegal war in Ukraine, stating that the best way to end the war in Ukraine is to support Ukraine with arms, while also not giving aid and comfort to Russia, its puppets and client states, and dictators around the world. And that's a quote. Meanwhile, President Zelensky is on his way to Washington with the partial expectation that he will sign the Ukraine-US mineral deal tomorrow, February 28. However, so far, a significant sticking point for Ukraine that appears to remain is the absence of robust security guarantees from the US, with Zelensky, who has emphasized many a time that without concrete assurances to protect Ukraine from future aggression, any ceasefire or peace deal would be fragile and ultimately ineffective, warning that nothing will work without such commitments. It's all still a little bit too speculative for me at this point, with tomorrow likely to be the day where the geopolitical landscape becomes a much more clearer picture. Then headed across to some interesting Ukrainian hardware news updates, because in a significant leap for battlefield communication, Ukrainian startup Hymera is on the verge of securing contracts with NATO and the US Defense Department. Their innovative walkie-talkies, already in use by thousands of Ukrainian soldiers, are set to receive additional enhancements with quantum-proof encryption. This upgrade aims to further safeguard military communications against future quantum computing threats, a concern echoing through the corridors of military tech units worldwide. And with 1.2 million in funding and ongoing tests by the US, the Air Force, Hymera's devices promise a cost-effective alternative to existing military-grade radios and are potentially priced 5 to 10 times lower. But the question might be, how does a conventional silicon chip mitigate the concerns of much more powerful quantum computer infiltration attempts? Well, it's the fancy new lock algorithm specifically designed against the quantum threat, because it uses software locking mechanisms alongside mathematical algorithms that quantum computers have a great deal of difficulty cracking. It's like a puzzle they're really bad at solving. Current methodologies to circumvent hacking attacks for radio communications are by way of the standard AES 256-bit encryption, and as you might guess, secure communications are critical for the military and for enterprise, so it's no wonder that, for instance, the US DoD takes an interest. Plus, as with most military inventions or innovations, it's a practical certainty that you will see upgrades to encryption like this on your very own personal laptops, computers, or smartphones one day soon. Then headed to a few Russian sentiments to round off the video today, guys. So, Russian Z-bloggers are continuing to have a change of heart. They're admitting now, those occupied territories, not worth the cost. One post bluntly states that the so-called special military operation isn't about saving the Donbass, but about boosting Russia's status on the global stage. So it's a candid perspective from within Russia's own ranks, highlighting a troubling reality. The war is less about people and more about profit and power. And many a times, part of war is about in this case, the Russian population waking themselves up. There's an easy way, and there's a hard way. And no surprises here, Russians have been opting for the hard way, so far. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe. I ran out of time quite a bit today, but back to the regular tomorrow, squeeze in some more funnies. So thanks again, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!